Alright, so we're ready to go. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to continue our look at extinction and stimulus control, but we're also going to kind of have a review of a lot of what we've seen up until this point, and it's all going to be in service of analyzing the treatment of Harry. So if you recall, last class we took a look at the treatment of Harry. He was the self-injurious individual who would injure himself, hit himself in the face, knee himself, bite himself in order to escape activities. And Dr. Fox came in, put it in an extinction paradigm amongst other contingencies and other things that we're going to take a look at today, and basically helped him to learn how to not abuse himself, went through an extinction procedure on that behavior, and came out the other side with new behaviors that were appropriate behaviors, is what the term that they use. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at basically the entire section of treatment and kind of do some callbacks to some of the previous things that we've taken a look at to see how they would actually be applied in this particular real world situation. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at in the treatment of Harry was what happened when they were designing this study. And as we're going to see, they used two types of studies to take advantage of the fact, or to overcome the fact, that they designed this treatment program specifically for Harry. So Harry was a single subject. They didn't have time to wait for other people that fit Harry's characteristics. They couldn't wait for another 6'6" male who used self-injury to intimidate others in order to get a sample of people like Harry. They had to use Harry himself as a single subject, and because of that, they used single subject designs to ensure that the treatment that they devised specifically for Harry was actually working for Harry. So we mentioned this before when we, early on when we were talking about single subject designs, we talked about the reversal design. So in the reversal design, you start off with a baseline period. After the baseline, you introduce the treatment condition. And then what you do in a reversal design is you actually reverse the treatment. You take away the treatment, you revert back to baseline, and then if you find that your treatment was successful, you then go back to the permanent treatment. So we saw this before when we were looking at a treatment for the number of cigarettes smoked. So at first, you don't have any treatment, you just measure the baseline behavior. How bad is the behavior that you're trying to get rid of? Then you institute the treatment, and you see if the behavior decreases, if you have the desired effect on the behavior. And then you return to baseline in order to determine if it was your treatment that was causing that change in behavior. Now, why was this important for a single subject design to return to baseline? Why can't you just be happy with this and move on? To see if it's actually working. So you need to return to baseline because other things might be the reason why the behavior went down. Other things other things other than your treatment might be the reason that the behavior actually goes down. So when you remove the treatment, those other things are assumed to continue, and if the behavior goes back to those previous levels, that's good evidence that it was your treatment that caused the change, at which point you have the permanent adoption of that particular treatment. And this was one of the things that we saw in Harry's treatment. So you remember on their first day of treatment, Dr. Fox mentioned that they started off with 8 baseline sessions to determine just how bad Harry's self-abuse was across a variety of different situations. So they had him trying to do some homework, here, and he was allowed to freely self-abuse. So at this point, there was no treatment. They weren't trying to stop him from self-abusing, absolutely no treatment, and they simply measured how often does he self-abuse. How often does he self-abuse when he's doing homework? How often does he self-abuse when he's left alone? How often does he self-abuse when he is eating a meal? And if you listen carefully, you'll hear at one point they have a variety of raters going at 5-second intervals, measuring how often he hits himself. So literally what they did is they had a stopwatch, and they would say something like, okay, start right now, and people would just count 1, 2, 3, and then the time period would stop, and they're like, okay, let's start again. 1, 2, and they would write down what was his rate of self-abuse. That was the baseline session. So they freely allowed Harry to self-abuse, no treatment whatsoever. Then they started the treatment session. And in the treatment session, they had a variety of different treatments, and we'll dissect all of those and take a closer look at all of those. But in essence, what they did was they used that differential reinforcement of other behavior. They had an extinction paradigm, and on top of it, they had a reinforcement paradigm or procedure stacked on top. So the extinction procedure was the self-abuse would no longer be reinforced. So the self-abuse had no reinforcement as a consequence. And then also you could earn reinforcement, Harry could earn reinforcement by doing appropriate tasks like counting to 100, catching the ball, and completing work pages later on. So they go through the treatment session, and lo and behold, self-abuse went down. The rate of self-abuse during the treatment sessions went down to 0, and they had 17 minutes by the end of the day, over 17 minutes of a period of no self-abuse. And at this point, they would have loved to have said, you know what, this treatment is working, this is great, let's just continue doing this with Harry for the rest of his life and we can cure his self-injury. But they couldn't do that because something else might have been the reason that Harry stopped self-abusing. So that something else could be anything. It could be the fact that maybe Harry got scared of Dr. Fox. Maybe it was actually Dr. Fox was the reason that Harry stopped self-abusing. And Harry said, this scary man with an endless supply of shirts, is the reason I'm not going to self-abuse, right? It could be that he didn't self-abuse because Dr. Fox had a beard. It could be that Harry just watched a movie the day before where the hero was a person who didn't self-abuse. I don't know. It could be, the key here is that it could be anything. Anything else could have caused Harry's self-abuse to go down on that particular day. And if you don't isolate that it's the treatment that caused the change, then what you're going to do is you're going to hand over a useless treatment to the parents and the caregivers, and you're going to tell them, look, keep doing this and Harry will no longer self-abuse. And sure enough, Harry will begin to self-abuse again because it's not your treatment that's effective. So you have to figure it out. Was it the treatment that was effective? And because in order to do that, they used a reversal design. They went back to the baseline. So the second day that Dr. Fox was able to work with Harry, they began that day with a return to baseline. And they basically said there's no consequences for self-abuse. We'll let Harry self-abuse as much as he wanted to. And that self-abuse went right back up to the previous levels. And that was scientific evidence that it wasn't something else. It wasn't the fact that Dr. Fox was there. It wasn't the fact that he had a beard. It wasn't the fact that Harry had watched the movie previously. It wasn't anything else except the treatment that caused the desire for a decrease in self-abuse. And that's why once they determined that, they instituted the treatment, and Harry was basically on that treatment program for the rest of his life. So you remember even later on when he was wearing the glasses, when he was working in the mail room at the care center, they still said we have to stay very contingent with Harry. He was still on that treatment session. The other important thing to note about this use of the reversal design, and they were very clear about this, was that when they had observed Harry initially, what they determined was that even though his self-abuse was a problem, it was not so dangerous that a reversal design would have been unethical. So if Harry truly was a dangerous threat to himself or others, if he was, for example, self-abusing with a knife or with some other form of weapon where his life was in danger, then you couldn't use this design. You can't do a reversal design in those conditions. But they had determined that even though the self-abuse was a problem, it wasn't dangerous enough to not use the reversal. So they did that, determined it was a treatment, it was that extinction procedure with the differential reinforcement of other behavior, and they instituted that for the rest of Harry's time. All right, so there was one other design that they used from the single subject designs in this case. So they did two kind of other things. Number one, they treated Harry in different situations. So you remember that they were in the treatment room at one point. After that, they went out into the community and they treated him there. After that, he was treated in a school setting. So that's another type of design. And then also they treated different behaviors. So these are both examples of the single subject designs where they use multiple baselines across different situations or, settings or behaviors. So in this case, they used both of these. They didn't explicitly show that this is a multiple baseline design because they didn't measure the baseline in these different areas. So it's a bit of a sloppy baseline, but it is a multiple baseline nonetheless. So one example that they had was they treated Harry across different settings. So they treated him in the experimental room, treatments began, then they treated him outside, then they treated him in a school setting. But also they treated different behaviors that Harry had as well. So the different settings again, in the experimental room, outside in the real world, in the classroom later on. They treated him across a variety of different sessions, but they also did behavior across, multiple baselines across different behaviors. So did anybody catch what other behavior other than self-abuse did they specifically target with Harry? Yep.
Was it like his staring problem?
Yes, it was his staring problem. It was his close talking. It was where he would get into people's faces in order to intimidate them. So if you rewatch the video, you'll notice that when they begin treating Harry on the first few sessions, they don't touch the intimidation. They don't touch the close talking. They tolerate it. They go through with it. If he gets in their face, they just keep going. It's only later on that they start treating that using different sort of contingencies. So that thing about, I'm not going to talk to you if you're in my face. We're going to go play some ball as soon as you get out. And it's really weird watching Dr. Fox because he will, literally, as soon as Harry got close, he stops. And then Harry goes away and he's like, we're going to go outside. We're going to be playing some ball. And as soon as you do this. And he uses different techniques. So he uses stopping talking to Harry as one technique, one consequence. And he also uses actually getting in Harry's face as a second consequence. So if you remember that period where he goes, if you do it to me, I'm going to do it to you. It's like, this isn't very nice, getting into your face. So we're going to see exactly what that is in terms of contingencies, but it was very interesting that they did not treat that close talking, that intimidation, until after they had started to treat the self-abuse. And what this showed was the fact that the self-abuse went down when the treatment for self-abuse began, and then the close talking went down when the treatment for it began. That's multiple baseline across different behaviors, and that pattern is indicating once again that it's not Dr. Fox that's changing this behavior. It's not the fact that he has a beard. It's not some other factor that would be changing these behaviors, because if it was, then you would have as much a chance that the self-abuse would go down as the close talking would go down before you specifically treated it. So the fact that they only went down when they specifically began treating those behaviors eliminates the possibility that something else was causing a change in these behaviors. All right, so the next thing we're going to take a look at, and that was used in Harry extensively, is the 4 different types of contingencies. So there was actually all 4 contingencies were used in either Harry's treatment or in Harry's history, unfortunately. So the first one we're going to take a look at is negative punishment. So what was it that we saw in Harry's treatment where if Harry had a behavior, something was taken away, and as a result of that takeaway, that behavior actually decreased? That is the negative punishment. So anybody remember what happened there? Yep.
The restraints.
The restraints. So the contingency that Harry was under, where the restraints were in the room, and if he self-abused, they were gone for 5 minutes, that timeout period from restraints, that's negative punishment. So when Harry self-abused, something was taken away, the restraints were taken away. As a result, his self-abuse went down. Taking away the restraints is negative punishment. So that's one of the contingencies that was in play. A second contingency that was in play was positive punishment. So Harry was positively punished actually during the treatment. Now, originally, and this is interesting, they had planned on a positive punishment situation if needed. So when they were talking about the different levels of contingencies that they had level number 1, we'll take away his restraints for 5 minutes. Level number 2, we will restrain his entire body. Level number 3, we will provide brief contingent electrical shocks to his arms. Level number 3 would be an example of positive punishment. You self-abuse, I'm going to present something, it's going to be electric shocks. That will cause the self-abuse to go down. That will be an example of positive punishment. They actually didn't have to get to that level, but they did use some positive punishment. So does anybody remember a positive punishment situation? It wasn't for self-abuse. It was for his other behavior. The staring. And what was an example of positive punishment?
Shoving his face in there was presenting something, so that changed the behavior and decreased it.
Exactly. So when Dr. Fox put his face into Harry's face, that part where Dr. Fox was saying, if you do this to me, I'm going to do this to you. If you get into my face, I'm going to get into your face. Well, that was a consequence of Harry trying to intimidate Dr. Fox. So Harry did that close-talking intimidation, and when Harry did that, Dr. Fox presented something. He presented his face super close to Harry. That caused Harry's behavior to decrease. So that positive presentation of Dr. Fox's face as a result of the intimidation caused the intimidation to decrease, and that's an example of positive punishment. All right, positive reinforcement. There was a number of different examples of positive reinforcement. So what are some of those examples? So Harry did a behavior, an appropriate behavior. That behavior was then presented with something. As a result, that behavior increased. So what are some of those examples? Mm-hmm.
When he completed the task, he received his restraints.
Okay, so positive reinforcement, when he completed a task, he got his restraints back. So that's one example of positive reinforcement. Yep.
He was given like sips of Coke and
Sips of Coke and
pretzels.
sips of pretzels, positive reinforcement as well. He was asked to do a task. He was presented with Coke and pretzels for completing that task. The probability of that task being completed increased. That's positive reinforcement. Other examples? Mm-hmm.
When Dr. Fox would hug him.
Hugs from Dr. Fox is an example. So Harry had appropriate behaviors. That resulted in Dr. Fox presenting something, presenting hugs and affection. There was also one related to that. It was a verbal behavior.
I would think so, like.
Yep.
Was it when he would say like good boy or something?
Exactly. So all the praise that Harry was given is another example of positive reinforcement. So the praise when he caught the ball, and they're like, "Good catch, good catch on the ball, good job, Harry." That's all examples of positive reinforcement. The earning back of the restraints is an example of positive reinforcement. The Coke and pretzels were examples of positive reinforcement. The hugs were examples of positive reinforcement. Basically, they did this to reinforce the appropriate behaviors. So not just get rid of the self-abuse, but also increase any of those appropriate behaviors like number counting, like catching the ball, like actually completing the homework assignment. All right, and then there was, not in his treatment necessarily, but there was an example of negative reinforcement. And this is basically what caused Harry's self-abuse to get as bad as it did. So kind of using your intuition and a little bit of what Dr. Fox said, how was Harry's self-abuse negatively reinforced throughout his lifetime? Yep.
It's like take the task away if you didn't want to do it.
Exactly. So Harry's self-abuse got to the point where it was, to the problem that it became, partly through negative reinforcement. So as Dr. Fox mentioned, when Harry was presented with a task that he didn't want to do, he would mumble something. If he was pressed, he would then self-abuse. At that point, the task would be removed. So that is an example of negative reinforcement. You have this task to do. This task is part of your situation. You self-abuse, the task gets taken away, self-abuse increases. So Harry's self-abuse got to the point where it was because of this history of negative reinforcement for Harry's self-abuse. And that's one of the kind of really unfortunate things about Harry. And one of the things I love about Dr. Fox's treatment of Harry is when he was doing that close talking interaction with him, he mentions to Harry, he goes, that's what crazy people do. He goes, you're not crazy, so stop doing that. And when you take a look at Harry, Harry was not crazy. Harry was not at all, functioning differently than other people. All of us have a history of self-abuse. All of us have at some point probably threatened our parents with, I'll hold my breath until I get this. We've probably done other things where we're like, well, I'm just going to do myself some sort of self-harm in order to either guilt you into allowing me to do whatever it is that I'm doing. We've all had those moments. The difference between us and Harry is, number one, we kind of started with a different level. So Harry, there was something going on where Harry was, as a child, abusing himself, right? Because remember, they said they had to place those paper towel rolls on his arms to keep him from self-abusing when he was a child. So he was starting at a higher level than most people. He was a gifted self-abuser, if you want to. But what made it worse was he was reinforced for that self-abuse. So whereas when a child goes to their parents and says, you know what, I'm going to hold my breath until I get that chocolate bar, your parent will say, go ahead, give it a try. And you will very quickly learn that self-abuse does not work. Unfortunately, in Harry's situation, he was reinforced for his self-abuse, and that's why it escalated to the point that it did and got so much worse. So that negative reinforcement, that you need to do this, you self-abuse, I'm going to take that demand away, that negatively reinforced his self-abuse, made it more frequent and made it more strong. All right, next thing we're going to look at, shaping. We saw shaping in this treatment of Harry. We saw them start off with Harry at a position that he was able to do certain things, and then little bit by little bit, they changed his behavior until he was able to do very, very complicated things. So what was the primary behavior that they were trying to shape? What was the primary kind of criteria or characteristic that they were trying to shape? Yep.
Just making it to rules, I guess, so shaping away from self-harm.
Okay, so they were shaping him away from self-harm. how did they measure that? What were they trying to increase every single trial, every single treatment session? What was that?
Compliance,
Compliance. Specifically, how is it measured? Yep.
like in the time, so they measure.
The times. So what they were specifically shaping was the time out of restraints without self-abuse. That was the behavior that they were shaping. And if you take a look at their treatment, when they started Harry off, they started, whoops, one too many. They started with a time that they knew Harry could do. So when they first started his treatment sessions, they started with a time without self-abusing that they knew he could handle, and then they reinforced that time, and then they used longer times, and they reinforced no self-abuse, and then they used longer times and longer times, until they basically got him to 24 hours out of restraints without self-abuse every single day. So that first treatment session was actually a failure. So if you remember, in the first treatment session, Harry self-abused. He got himself that 5 minutes timeout with no restraints. In the second treatment session, it was 2 minutes. They knew Harry could do 2 minutes. They had probably seen him do 2 minutes before. He was able to do 2 minutes. They reinforced 2 minutes and then used that as their new starting block. So again, they want to get to 24 hours in a day with no self-abuse. Right now, they got him at 2 minutes. Treatment session number 4, they shaped it. They expanded it a little bit more. Now they're up to 3.5 minutes with out of restraints with no self-abuse. And then they got treatment session 6, and they stretched it a little bit more. Now they're up to 5 minutes and 52 seconds without any self-abuse. And they continue to do this throughout the sessions. Treatment session number 7 was a failure. Treatment session number 10, they got them up to 6 minutes and 40 seconds without self-abuse. So they keep shaping the behavior that they want. They want 24 hours out of 24 hours. Right now, they got up to, I believe, in the end, well, he had a couple, there was a rough section where I think he self-abused like 3 times in a row. But eventually, by the end of the first day, they got him up to 17 minutes and 10 seconds with no self-abuse. On their way to 24 hours in a single day. So importantly, the theoretical idea behind operant conditioning is that if you left Harry to not self-abuse on his own, right? If you left Harry out of restraints, eventually, by chance, he would go 17 minutes with no self-abuse, right? Eventually, just by chance, just by the randomness of his amounts of self-abuse, he would go 17 minutes without self-abuse. And at that point, you could step in and go, oh, good job, Harry. Here's your restraints back. Way to go on those 17 minutes. That 17 minutes probably happens once every 10 years, right? Given his rate of self-abuse, it probably happens once every 10 years. So your option as a therapist is either sit around and wait once every 10 years to reinforce Harry for 17 minutes, or you can use shaping and get to that in a single day. And then when they went back to training on training session number 2, they kept shaping his behavior, and eventually they got him to 2 hours and 17 minutes out of restraints with no self-abuse. And then they just kept going until they got him to basically where he is 24 hours per day out of restraints with no self-abuse. So that was shaping, and again, it was required because this, though theoretically it could have happened when they began, would happen so infinitesimally improbably that it really would be ineffective. You have to go through shaping, and they started with things that Harry could do, and then they went and continued shaping the other behaviors. And this is also just kind of remind me, I don't have it up here, but what was an appropriate behavior that they started with? Does anybody remember the first appropriate task that they asked Harry to do? Counting to 100. So the very first thing they asked Harry to do was to count to 100. So while they were going through the extinction of his self-abuse, and they were shaping longer and longer periods out of restraints with no self-abuse, they were also trying to reinforce appropriate behaviors, and they started with counting to 100. And if you remember what Dr. Fox said, he specifically said, we started with counting to 100 because we knew it was something Harry could do. So they were starting with a behavior that they knew that he could do. And then later on, they got to more complicated behaviors, like working on the work page, sitting down for minutes on end, pointing to pigs and sheep and ducks, because they had shaped appropriate behaviors to where they could go a little bit more complicated. All right, next thing for the behavior that Harry was doing, we have this intermittent schedule of behavior. So if you remember the intermittent schedules, this is where a behavior is not punished or reinforced every single time, but it's reinforced on some pattern, some intermittent schedules. Not every single time, but it's a certain amount of times, either determined by the amount of times that you do a behavior or by the time duration or interval, whether or not it has expired. So in the treatment of Harry, they measured Harry's self-abuse. And what they found that Harry had in terms of his self-abuse, it had a certain pattern of self-abuse. There was a certain pattern to how often Harry abused. And what that pattern was, and Dr. Fox mentioned this, he goes, Harry had a high, stable rate of self-abuse. He had a very high, number one, high rate of self-abuse. Number two, it was stable. It wasn't interrupted. It didn't have any post-reinforcement pauses. He had himself a high, stable rate of self-abuse. So that high, stable rate of self-abuse is associated with one of the intermittent schedules of reinforcement. So what is the intermittent schedule of reinforcement that leads to a high, stable rate of self-abuse? Anybody remember which one it is? Which one? It's not fixed ratio, it's variable ratio. So it is ratio, but it's variable ratio. So this is why a lot of work has been done on these intermittent schedules of reinforcement, and why it's important to know about the different patterns. So the fixed ratio, if he was on a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, you would have the pattern where there was a post-reinforcement pauses. The fact that it was a stable rate of reinforcement meant that he was reinforced on a variable ratio of a schedule of reinforcement for his self-abuse. So they were able to identify that based on the pattern of his self-abuse. Now the question is, and this is one of the tragedies of Harry, where did his variable reinforcement of self-abuse come from? Who would have put Harry on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement where Harry was on a variable ratio schedule where his self-abuse was reinforced? It was the parents. So this is one of the tragedies of Harry's history. It was that his parents had put him on a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement for his self-abuse. Now, why would his parents do that? What was that? Okay, so they wanted to try to stop him from hitting himself. How did that lead to them reinforcing him hitting himself? Okay, so that's part of it. So they didn't always give him whatever he wanted because he was hitting himself, because that wouldn't be an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. That would be a continuous schedule of reinforcement. So why did they put him on an intermittent schedule? So they had him on a schedule of reinforcement because they were trying to get him to stop stop him from hitting himself. Why do they put him on a variable schedule?
Because sometimes they would say no, but then he would have like a burst, and then like, oh, okay.
Exactly. So it was the sometimes they would say no. And the reason that sometimes they would say no and they put him on the schedule is the tragedy of what happened to Harry is because his parents actually cared. His parents actually tried to help Harry out. And what would happen is that, and this is speculation, but what's not speculation is that he was intermittently reinforced because he had a high stable rate of self-abuse. So we know as psychologists, intermittent reinforcement had to have occurred. The fact that it was so difficult to go through an extinction procedure on Harry also indicated that he was on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. Intermittent schedules of reinforcement are much more difficult to go through extinction on. They last much longer through the extinction procedure. And we know that this high stable rate had to have been intermittently reinforced, and it was probably the parents that did this because they cared. So let's start off with parents that did not care, right? Let's take a look at the situation where parents didn't care. If they went up to Harry and they said, Harry, you gotta make your bed. And Harry's like, no, and he self-abuses. And the parents were like, fine, don't make your bed, right? He would have been on a continuous schedule of reinforcement. If they said, Harry, you gotta do your homework, and Harry's like, no, and they're like, fine, you don't have to do your homework. Harry, we gotta clean up your bedroom. No, all right, fine, you don't have to clean up your bedroom. If they had done it every single time, he would have been on a continuous schedule of reinforcement. And continuous schedules of reinforcement are easy to go through extinction on. Because it doesn't take you too long if you're getting reinforced every single time. It doesn't take you too long to realize you're no longer being reinforced, right? The kind of classic example is the difference between a brand new car and an old car that has trouble starting. If you have a brand new car and you turn the key and it starts, and you turn the key and it starts, and you turn the key and it starts, you're on a continuous schedule of reinforcement. You turn the key and it starts. One day you go there, you turn the key, it doesn't start. You try it again, it doesn't start. You try a third time, it doesn't start. You give up and you take it to the mechanic, right? You know that something's wrong with your car. The extinction procedure of turning it, no longer being reinforced, didn't take you too long. What if you have an old jalopy that takes you on average 10 tries to turn it on in the morning? So you start it up and it doesn't work, you start it up and it doesn't work, you start it up and it doesn't work. On average, after 10 times, you finally turn the key and it springs to life. Once that car finally dies, you will probably spend like an hour that morning trying to turn it on, right? You will be like 10 times, didn't work, 11 times, didn't work, 20 times, still not working. Maybe it's this time, baby, come on, 30 times, still not working. You're gonna try it a whole lot longer. That's what intermittent reinforcement does, is it elongates any sort of extinction procedure. So if the parents were uncaring and basically gave in to Harry every single time he self-abused, Dr. Fox could have waltzed in there, it would have been way easier than the mountain that he had to climb. The problem was is that Harry was on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. It was a variable ratio schedule. And this was because the parents actually cared and they tried. So there would be days when they would go to Harry and they would say, Harry, you gotta do your homework. And Harry would be like, no. And they would say, come on, Harry, you gotta do your homework. And Harry would be like, no. And they would say, you gotta give it a try. No. And maybe it took 10 times before Harry's parents finally gave in. And they would say, okay, fine, you know what, we won't do your homework. You don't have to do your homework, and they gave in. Sometimes it would take 10 times. Sometimes it wouldn't take 10 times. Let's imagine that the parents, because they're human, had a bad day, right? We've all been there. Our willpower is just gone. We've just had a bad day. We just want to get to rest. We just want to get, finished with the day. We walk in there and we're like, Harry, we got to do your homework. And Harry's like, no. And you're like, come on, Harry, let's just do our homework. And Harry's like, no. And you're like, fine, I can't deal with it today. 2 times is enough. That's all I got. Other days, the parents were feeling great. And they were like, you know what? Today is the day. Today is the day I don't back down. Doesn't matter how much Harry self-abuses. And they walk up and they're like, Harry, you're doing your homework. And he's like, no. And they're like, not this time. You're doing your homework. No. You're doing your homework. No. You're doing your homework. No. Maybe this time it took 20 times because they had a lot of willpower. Finally, before Harry went out. So, because of the fact that they were humans and they were trying, sometimes Harry would have to self-abuse 10 times before he got his way. Sometimes he would have to self-abuse 20 times before he got his way. Sometimes he would only have to self-abuse the one time before the parents were just like, it's a bad day, let's just give in to Harry today. Because of their human nature, they placed him on a variable schedule of reinforcement. Because he was on that variable schedule, that variable ratio schedule, they actually made his self-abuse much higher in rate and much more difficult to go through the extinction procedure. So this is an excellent example of why it's not enough in psychology to have good intentions. Because a lot of well-meaning people, like Harry's parents, made the problem worse than if they were, and that's one of the kind of ironies and the tragedies of it. It would have been a lot better off if Harry came from uncaring parents. Dr. Fox would have had a lot easier time to get rid of his self-abuse. All right. This was a really good one. Theories of reinforcement. So, when they were treating Harry, they decided that Harry was going to be reinforced by his restraints. So they were going to give the restraints to Harry as reinforcement. And this is something that makes absolutely no sense unless you know the underlying theories behind it. Because who in their right mind would find restraints reinforcing? Well, I don't want to kink shame anybody, but typically, who would find restraints reinforcing, right? Whoever sees a police officer and says, "Oh man, I hope I get arrested because those handcuffs would feel great right now," right? Most of us don't like it. We don't like to be, handcuffed. Anyway, but they knew Harry's restraints would be reinforcing. How did they know that? How did they know going in, without any trial and error, how did they know that if we take away Harry's restraints, he will work to earn them back? How did they know that those restraints would be reinforcing? It's an application of the response deprivation hypothesis. Yep.
Is that because the only time Harry gave the employees trouble was when they asked him to take them off within those periods of time?
Yes. So the only time Harry ever gave them trouble was when they asked him to take off his restraints. That's another way of saying, we'll put it in a more explicit way, how often did Harry want to wear restraints? What was his preferred level of wearing restraints? Always. Harry always wanted to wear restraints. Left to himself, he always wanted to wear them. His preferred level was 24 hours in a day. He wanted to wear his restraints 24 hours in a day. So when Dr. Fox took those restraints away and said, look, you count to 100 and I will give you back your restraints, what he did was he restricted access to the behavior. He took the restraints away and he says, I am restricting access to these restraints. I'm restricting that access to the behavior, and the frequency fell below the preferred level of the behavior, the preferred level of occurrence. So Harry wanted it 24 hours a day. Now he was getting it 23 hours and 55 minutes a day, because it would take him about 5 minutes to count to 100, right? It doesn't matter how much of a dip it was. He wanted 24 hours a day. He was now getting less. It was restricted, and it fell below his preferred level. Because of that, they knew going in that taking those restraints away and giving them back would be reinforcing for Harry. The restraints were reinforcement because he wanted them 24 hours. They restricted his access to the restraints, and that fell below his preferred level of occurrence. So that's why from the get-go, they knew that taking those restraints away would be reinforcing for Harry. And they did mention that it was gratifying. He used that term. He goes, it's gratifying that he was working to earn the restraints back, because that indicated that they were reinforcing. But notice that they didn't have to go through a whole bunch of guesswork. They didn't have to say things like, well, let's try food. Maybe if we give him chocolate bars, like the Three Musketeers bar that he bought at the 7-Eleven. Maybe if we use that for reinforcement, that will be good. Maybe we should try TV time. Maybe we should try these other things, right? Let's try a whole bunch and see what works as a reinforcer. They didn't have to do that because they knew Harry would wear his restraints 24 hours a day, take the restraints away for a couple of minutes, falls below his preferred level, the restraints will be reinforcing then for Harry. All right, and in terms of the extinction procedures that we saw a bunch of the side effects for the extinction procedure. So there was the extinction burst. So we saw that Harry got, when the extinction was going through, we saw that his self-abuse got much stronger than it was before. So if you recall, during the baseline periods where Harry was not being treated, he had self-abuse, but it wasn't that impactful. So if you recall, when he was eating, he was just kind of tapping himself a little bit on the head. But when he started going through the extinction procedure, he got very agitated, and he started abusing a lot. So the slams on the door were very hard. You probably remember he was hitting his leg, and it was actually like buckling underneath from how hard he was hitting it. The abuse got worse when the extinction procedure began, and that is that classic extinction burst. To a psychologist like Dr. Fox, they were probably watching that through the one-way mirror, saying, wow, his self-abuse is way worse now than it was at the beginning of the day. That's awesome, our procedure is working, we gotta stick to it, we gotta go through this extinction burst. We also saw increases in variability during Harry's extinction procedure. So primarily, at the beginning, Harry would self-abuse, and he would self-abuse with his hand. Occasionally he would bite himself, but not very often. And then when he was going through the extinction procedure, other behaviors that did not show up previously all of a sudden came out. So they had behaviors like him trying to self-restrain himself. That's an increase in variability. That's a behavior that didn't previously occur, but now was occurring. The numerous shirt tearing that occurred, I believe in the first, they weren't even out of the baseline phase, and Dr. Fox already went through 3 shirts that day. And I'm amazed he had them waiting. He must have known beforehand. But again, this was not a behavior that they had seen prior to the extinction procedure. And again, Harry trying to self-restrain, Harry putting himself in a corner. All of these were increases in variability that didn't previously occur, but now that Harry was going through the extinction procedure, it was these new types of behaviors were coming up. All right, emotional behavior. I don't even have screenshots of this because it was everywhere. There was tons of emotional behavior. Harry was not happy with any of what was going on. So just the screams of no that Harry went through sometimes were very difficult to watch. You could see that he was frustrated, slamming on the door over and over again. This again is an indication that the extinction procedure was working. And then we also saw, just as like I mentioned, slamming on the door, we also saw aggression oftentimes. So the yelling would be an example of frustration behavior, and the aggression, frustration-induced behavior. So the yelling, slamming on the doors. And one of the things I also love about this treatment of Harry is that as you go along and you kind of get to know Harry a little bit better, you see that he is he seems like a very good-hearted, good-natured individual. So when he was playing with the ball, he has a sense of humor. He threw one under his leg and was engaging with Dr. Fox. And as much as he slammed the door, right, as much as he took his frustration out on that door and basically pummeled that door massively, you'll notice he never once hit Dr. Fox or any of the other workers. Yeah, he tried to put his hands into their shirts, and he ripped about 4 or 5 shirts during the treatment. But remember, they mentioned that he's not aggressing against them. He was trying to restrain himself in their shirts. But he slammed on that door massively that frustration-induced aggression, but not once did he ever hit Dr. Fox. So, has a good heart, he's a good-natured individual, and that's one of the really uplifting, gratifying things about this entire treatment. All right, resurgence. We didn't see too much of resurgence. So resurgence would have been if Harry started doing behaviors that had previously once been effective. So I don't know if maybe the yelling was a resurgence. Maybe he used to get his way when he was yelling more. I don't know if other behaviors other than self-abuse might have been a resurgence. I do remember that at one point he was in the second treatment day, he was biting himself, like right in front of Dr. Fox. That might have been resurgence if biting was a type of self-abuse that he did when he was younger, that was previously successful, but now, you know, he's returning to that. But it's kind of hard to say whether or not there was any sort of resurgence without exactly knowing his history of self-abuse. All right, depression and depression-like symptoms. Harry was not happy during this procedure. He was not ever, when the restraints were taken away, he was never happy about that, never pleased, never having a positive mood because of that. And again, this is one of those side effects of extinction that we need to know about because we want to get to the end result, which is very beneficial for Harry, but as you saw, we got to go through a ton of unpleasant side effects to get through that other side. All right. Final thing that I think we have to kind of dissect this treatment, and this is part of the extinction procedure. So when Dr. Fox put Harry on an extinction procedure, they were very, very careful to put him on a differential reinforcement of other behavior procedure. And this is that concurrent schedule where you have an extinction schedule where Harry is no longer being reinforced for self-injury, but at the same time, you choose other behaviors that he does earn reinforcement for. So you do allow him to earn reinforcement, but now you're reinforcing other behaviors, appropriate behaviors, when you're not reinforcing his self-abuse. So whereas if people took Harry out of his restraints and Harry self-abused, he would be rewarded with his restraints back, for example, or he would be rewarded by the task being taken away. They were going through the extinction procedure, so they were no longer able to take the task away. They didn't want to negatively reinforce his self-abuse. And at the same time, they didn't want to give him his restraints back for self-abusing. So they needed to find a way to reinforce Harry by giving his restraints back, and that is the differential reinforcement of other behavior to earn back his restraints. Or if it's incompatible with self-abuse, it's the differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. So what were some of these other behaviors that they reinforced?
Playing ball.
Playing ball. So playing ball is one example. Is that differential reinforcement of other, or is that differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior? Other behavior, can you self-abuse while playing ball? So that would be incompatible behavior. So the fact that you needed your hands to play ball means that it is incompatible with using your hands to self-abuse. So that was one of the cases where they chose specifically something for Harry to do with his hands so that he couldn't self-abuse. And while I guess technically you can still kind of bite yourself, you can still slam your face on your knee, they chose something to do with his hands because hitting himself with his hands was his primary form of self-abuse. What was an example? Does anybody remember an example of differential reinforcement of other behavior? Something that he was reinforced for? That was
the counting and stitching? Because he wasn't occupying his hands, he was just still.
Exactly, yeah, that's a great example. So the counting is differential reinforcement of other behavior because it can be done while you're self-abusing. So you could literally count the number of times that you're hitting yourself as you count to 100. There's nothing about counting that stops you from being like 1, 2, 3, 4. But it was being reinforced. They were reinforcing him for counting So that's differential reinforcement, but it's of other behavior because it's not incompatible with the extinction procedure, which is self-abuse. The ball catching, though, is incompatible because you cannot catch and throw a ball if you're self-abusing. Yep.
So the hugging, would that be incompatible then?
Hugging would be another good example of an incompatible behavior because you cannot self-abuse while you're hugging. So when Dr. Fox was like, you know, oh, what did we forget? We forgot that hug. You know, come here, give me a hug. And Harry gave him a hug, and then Dr. Fox gave him a couple of pats on the back. That's positive reinforcement of the hugging behavior, and you cannot hug and at the same time, you know, self-abuse, at least with your hands. Other examples of differential reinforcement of other behavior? I know sometimes it's a little hard on one viewing. Yep.
Well, I guess I was gonna say like pouring Coke, but that would be incompatible because it was.
Yes. Okay. So we'll just go to differential reinforcement of incompatible or other. That's a great example of the differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. I know it's, you know, we probably only had the one viewing, so let's just kind of jog your memory a little bit. So catching the ball, differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, can't self-abuse while you're catching the ball. They had Harry do things like move the tables and the chairs. So whenever they were like, all right, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go get the tables, and we're gonna go get the chairs, and when we bring them in, we'll sit down and we'll work a couple of pages. Well, when you're moving a table, you can't self-abuse. So that's differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior.
Would him going like to the store and not self-abusing be an other behavior since he still can use his hands?
Yep. So when they took him to the store and they had him, you know, oh, go pick a, you know, chocolate bar that you like, go do anything else, you know, other things that we can do at the store, that was differential reinforcement of other behavior because you can't self-abuse while you're at the store. While they were outside playing catch with the ball again, that was differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. When they were asking him questions, you know, oh, what did you get at the icebox? You know, what did Mike get you at the icebox? And he's like, oh, 3 Musketeers. And they're like, oh, great job, Harry. That's differential reinforcement of other behavior because you can literally be like, he got me at 3 Musketeers. There's nothing to interfere with your self-abuse when you're doing those behaviors. So if it doesn't interfere, it's that differential reinforcement of other behavior. If it does interfere, it's that differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. And you could see that as they went further along, Dr. Fox said we tried to choose more activities for Harry to do something with his hands. Basically, he was saying we were trying to choose more activities that were the differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. So that whole thing about pouring a Coke, Dr. Fox had just poured a Coke. We clearly know Dr. Fox has the skills to pour a Coke. He didn't need Harry to do it, but he would say, oh, I would like some Coke too. Harry, can you pour me some Coke? Because pouring a Coke is incompatible with self-abuse. Saying cheers, right? Clinking cups together and saying cheers. When he said, all right, let's, you know, here's looking at you, kid. And he's like, oh, you're supposed to touch cups. And after we touch cups, we take a drink. You can't self-abuse when you're saying cheers. And it's very difficult to self-abuse while you're drinking. All differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. When Harry was working a page, and Dr. Fox said, you know, what are the animals? What are these? And Harry goes, you know, pig, hen, and ducks. Dr. Fox says, point at them. Where, you know, point to them. And he's like, oh, pigs, hens, and ducks, because you cannot self-abuse when you're pointing to animals on a page. So all of these behaviors that they chose at the end, as Harry's treatment went along, were all mostly differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. Anytime they gave Harry something to do with his hands that would prevent him from self-abusing, that was differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. All right, so that was the dissection of Harry's treatment. Any other final questions, comments, anything like that on the treatment of Harry?
Will this be on the test, like questions about Harry? And like,
Yes.
okay.
So questions about Harry will be on the exam. This is basically our look at the extinction process, the extinction procedure. So on that note, this video, if you weren't able to see it, I didn't want to post it on YouTube because it was previously on YouTube and then it was removed from YouTube. So I know that there's copyright issues there. And the last thing that I want to do is have my channel shut down because I had a copyright violation. So if you go to the video that is for the previous class, you will notice that all of the hairy video parts of it have been edited out. However, this video is available, number one, in the library, so there is a DVD of this in the library, if that's the way that you like to consume your media. But it is also available on this website called Internet Archive. And Internet Archive, and I sent out an announcement with a link to the video on Internet Archive. And Internet Archive is this great repository of videos, documents, images that are in the public domain. So these are videos that you can view online. These are videos that you are allowed, to use because the copyright that they're under is such that they can be used for, public displays. So I don't know if the copyright rules have changed on Harry's video. I know that there are changes in copyright rules the longer it gets from when the video was made. I know that if you guys are into remakes of movies from the 80s, if anybody's gonna go see Terminator Dark Fate, this coming Friday, the copyright, who owns the copyright on the original Terminator script is changing because it's been 35 years after the original movie came out, and after 35 years, ownership reversed back to the screenwriters and away from the producers. That tangent is just to tell you that copyright laws are weird. So because of that, I'm going to allow Internet Archive to vet themselves and take care of this and make sure that their copyright is good. And I'm trusting them in that regard. I didn't want to post it on YouTube because I don't feel that I have the copyright ability to do that. But just know that in the video description, there's a link that'll take you to the original video. In the announcement that I sent out, there's a link that'll take you to the online video. So you do have access to it. So if you want to watch it again, refresh your memory, maybe just check out certain parts to see some of the examples we were talking about. It is available, but just not on the actual YouTube lecture itself. Any other questions about the treatment of Harry before we wrap this up? All right, that is all good. So that is what we're going to do today.